Well, the Seattle Seahawks were so very close, but yet ultimately, due to not being able to stay out of their own way, so far away from stamping their place in history as back-to-back Super Bowl champions. It's rough for the Seattle Seahawks in a way because you get so close and it ends up not happening when you maybe expected it was going to happen. A lot of things indicated that it was going to happen, and so much was pointing to the fact that it was going to happen. And, it takes away from what was still a really good Seattle Seahawks season in 2014. You talk about a 12-4 team that won the NFC West, even though at one point in time they were sitting at 7-4, and you had some serious questions about this team and whether or not they really had this stuff to repeat. But they put it together at the right time. They were able to get through and navigate the NFC playoffs by beating the Panthers at home and then beating the Packers at home, and frankly, winning a game for so many intents and purposes they had no right winning and they flat out should have lost. Well, sometimes that's what good championship teams do. They find a way to win a game that they should have lost. Unfortunately for them in Super Bowl 49, they did the exact opposite. They found a way to lose a game that for all intents and purposes they should have won. You made the Super Bowl the year after winning the Super Bowl, and that is an incredible accomplishment in today's modern NFL, but at the end of the day, you played to win the championship, and the Seahawks didn't win the championship. But this is still a really good team. This is still one of the standard bearers, not just in the NFC, but all of the National Football League, one of the real marquee franchises. And the biggest single reason for that, beyond question, you could look outside of just having John Schneider as your general manager, who clearly has a clue, and Pete Carroll as your head coach, who clearly has a clue. It's their ability to execute a game plan consistently every year via the NFL draft and build a young nucleus and make a championship contender out of it. I mean, this is a team that has hit all over the place in the draft, especially in that 2010 to 2012 range. You look at their 2013 and 2014 classes, and they've, for the most part, are question marks. There's a lot of questions about what they're going to get out of them long term, but when you draft really well for a few years, that is bound to happen at some point in time, that you'll have some depth picks, some guys that will take some time to bear out. But you look back at 2013, maybe a guy like Christian Michael will get more playing time as time goes along. You look at a guy like a Jordan Hill, he showed some flashes in 2014. It was actually a big loss to that defense when he went down in the playoffs with the injury. Look at 2014, they got something out of Justin Britt, the second of their second-round picks out of Missouri. I thought he played better at right tackle as the season went along. We'll see what they get out of guys like Paul Richardson, what have you. But just so many different hits. Go back to 2010, getting Russell Okung and Earl Thomas. Remember, the Seahawks got a lot of grief for not taking Taylor Mays because a lot of people thought with the USC connection that Pete Carroll would take his guy Taylor Mays. It seems to be the trend sometimes with the Seattle Seahawks is when people like what they do, they don't do well. When people hate what they do incredibly well. Well, Russell Okung and Earl Thomas was really, frankly, where it all began for them in 2010, not to mention the success of taking a couple of mid-round picks in that 2010 draft and package them up to the Buffalo Bills in order to bring in Marshawn Lynch. These were the guys that really started to affect a change for the organization. These are the guys that really set the tone. These are the guys that really set the table and were the beginning foundation pieces for everything the Seattle Seahawks have done over the past couple of years. It was Russell Okung and Earl Thomas in that first round in 2010, and then that trade in 2010 of a couple of mid-round picks to get a guy like Marshawn Lynch. You look at a guy like 2011 fifth-round pick Cam Chancellor, arguably the best strong safety in all of the National Football League. You look at a guy like Richard Sherman, a fifth-round pick. Another guy, I think Chancellor was 2010, Sherman, fifth-round pick in 2011, a guy that went way under the radar coming out of Stanford, a guy who perfectly fit what the Seahawks are doing and, is arguably the best corner in all of the National Football League. You look at K.J. Wright, a linebacker who fits perfectly so many things that they want out of a linebacker on defense. Same thing with their second-round pick in 2012, Bobby Wagner. Here's a guy that you could really tell the difference in that defense between when he was there and when he wasn't there, although that Tony Dungy, that doesn't make him the MVP of the National Football League. But you look back at that 2012 draft, just in general, first-round pick Bruce Irvin, they got a lot of grief about, for myself included. He's been what they've needed out of him. You look at their second-round pick, Bobby Wagner. I was a fan of that pick, but I think a lot of people question because he was coming from a smaller school like Utah State, and we've seen what he's become. And then ultimately in the third round, they had sat there and already signed Matt Flynn via free agency, and there were questions about why they would take an undersized 5'10" quarterback like Russell Wilson. Well, joke's on us. The Seattle Seahawks found their quarterback, and not only that, they were able to find their franchise quarterback in the 3rd round. So many things of what they've done over the past couple of seasons were the fruits that were born out from the work that they did in the draft between 2010 to 2012. There is no question about it. Getting guys like Earl Thomas, Cam Chancellor, and Richard Sherman on the defensive side of the ball, and being able to find your guy at quarterback in the 3rd round of 2012 like a Russell Wilson, it's not hard to figure out why the Seahawks went to the Super Bowl in 2013 and won it all, and why they went back to the Super Bowl this 2014 season and, again, almost won it all. Not a lot of misses, still some questions, but they've had some hits and some really big hits in some key spots. Well, at some point in time when you're a successful team like the Seahawks have been, due to the salary cap era, what have you, you're going to lose some guys. It's just the nature of the beast. And they lost a former first-round pick in James Carpenter to the New York Jets via free agency. They lost Byron Maxwell, their number 2 corner, to the Eagles in free agency. They lost Malcolm Smith to the Raiders. They lost O'Brien Schofield, one of their kind of role player outside edge rushers. So they lost some guys. But for the Seattle Seahawks, they haven't lost anybody that would be considered like a crippling loss or a really, really bad loss or somebody that they can't potentially replace. They, for the most part, have been able to keep everybody that they've wanted to keep, and they still have a ton of cap room if they need to get a neat deal done with Russell Wilson. I'm surprised the deal hasn't already been done, but frankly, they don't have to do a deal with him right now. They could let him play out the season and franchise him and then try to do a long-term deal after 2015, but you envision at some point in time they'll get that deal done too. Well, it's understanding that you don't want to overpay for guys like Byron Maxwell and James Carpenter and Malcolm Smith and O'Brien Schofield, and understanding, how the draft process works and how important it is to build through the draft, and then executing well on your building through the NFL draft that allows you to be able to manage the cap and keep all the key core guys and still be a consistent contender. Well, when you look at the Seattle Seahawks, they've already done some of their work when it comes to this 2015 NFL draft. They're in a position where they could roll the dice. They're in a position where they could gamble, and that's exactly what they did. They traded a quality center in Max Unger in their 1st-round pick to the New Orleans Saints, for All-Pro tight end or Pro Bowl tight end Jimmy Graham, and the Saints' 4th-round pick. There's no question when you watch the Seahawks team in 2014, they lacked weapons on the outside at wide receiver and tight end, and they in particular lacked a really steady, reliable weapon in the passing game in the red zone, not named Marshawn Lynch. When your running back is your best passing threat in the red zone, you've got some problems, no matter even if it is beast mode Marshawn Lynch. Well, the Seattle Seahawks went about addressing by far their biggest need. Now, some might argue that biggest need was technically wide receiver, and perhaps it is. You figure Jimmy Graham lines up so often outside, what the hell difference does it make anyways? But the biggest thing of all they need is they needed a big-time number 1 type of weapon. And they needed a big-time number 1 type of weapon that could sit there and create mismatches all over the field, and on top of that, be that reliable, big-time red zone threat that Russell Wilson and the Seahawks offense just haven't had over the past few seasons. Well, in one phase, it's already a big success and mission accomplished for the Seahawks when it comes to this 2015 NFL draft. So what else do they need to address with the draft, with the limited picks that they'll have, especially with them not picking at this point all the way until pick number 63? There's a couple different philosophies in terms of what they could do, in terms of philosophies. They could just sit there and take best player available at each of the remaining picks that they have and then be done. They could look to address specific needs and find guys that fit their schemes on both sides of the ball. And again, that's something that could be done. This could be a team that could look to take some of the picks that they have this year, kind of classify this as a somewhat lost draft in a way, and maybe use some of those picks to acquire draft pick currency for future drafts, and that might be a way to go. But in terms of biggest needs, let's say they do try to use most of their picks. Where would they look at? I think the biggest needs you've got to look at are on both lines, offense and defense, and then the skill players on offense and defense. I think wide receiver is still their biggest need on this team, although a very close second would be corner. Once you get past Richard Sherman, and even when they had Byron Maxwell, the Seahawks secondary could be had. They were a 3-man legion of movement. This was not a complete unit. This was a unit that lacked depth, that lacked the ability to match up with opposing slot receivers, and frankly lacked the skill on the outside to consistently match up with other teams' number 2 wide receivers. It could be argued that arguably the biggest need on the Seahawks team, because of the identity of their team on the defensive side of the ball, and how important that secondary is, that corner is their biggest need, both an outside corner and a slot corner. And it'd be hard to argue that. Wide receiver is most certainly a biggest need when you sit there and have 3 undrafted players as your starting wide receivers, and Doug Baldwin, Jermaine Kearse, and Ricardo Lockett, and you throw a 4th one into the mix, and Chris Matthews. While that could speak to some of the success of what you've done in terms of the draft and finding gems in the undrafted ranks, You know, they were undrafted for a reason. You know, and relying on just those guys to get it done is not going to get it done. And you look at the offensive line. You've traded Max Unger. You let James Carpenter walk via free agency. An offensive line that already struggled at times to protect Russell Wilson up the middle and at times struggled to run block up the middle in 2014. Just got a bigger problem area there, losing two of their starters in Unger and Carpenter. That's a position that will have to be addressed at some point in time in this draft. There's no question about that. They could also use some depth on the defensive line, in particular on the inside of defensive tackle. You know, Kevin Williams is a nice kind of stopgap in 2014, and maybe they think an Atia Rubin will be a nice stopgap in 2015, but it would have to be nice for them to find somebody that's more than just a stopgap, but a guy that can be another key core piece going forward. You know, in terms of the philosophy for the Seattle Seahawks, I guess I'll say this, is that if people are going to knock them for what they do in the draft, then that probably means that they're doing a good job. If people are going to praise them for what they do, that probably means they're not doing such a good job. The Seahawks need to do what the Seahawks need to do. And frankly, at this point in time, until proven otherwise, and only time will prove out whether they're right or not, at the end of the day, the Seahawks just need to do whatever the fuck they want to do, because for the most part, it is freaking work, and we have been wrong about this team. So why are we going to start being right about them? And until proven otherwise, why would the Seahawks be wrong about what they're doing? Do what they want to do what they feel is best. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, basically.